The champagne flute trembled in my grip as Dad's voice boomed across the reception hall, cutting through the gentle murmur of conversation like a foghorn through morning mist. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention." The string quartet fell silent, violins hanging mid-note as 200 guests turned toward the head table where my father stood. Microphone in one hand, bourbon in the other, that familiar gleam in his eyes that meant someone was about to become his entertainment. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you." My stomach dropped as his gaze swept across my siblings before landing on me like a spotlight I'd spent 32 years trying to avoid. Emma, radiant in her wedding dress, shot me an apologetic look from where she sat beside her new husband Marcus. My brother Jake shifted uncomfortably in his groomsman tuxedo, already knowing where this was headed. We all did. This was Dad's stage, and I was about to become his favorite punchline once again. "Now I've got 3 beautiful children," Dad continued, his politician's smile stretching wide as he gestured toward us with theatrical flair. "My Emma here, smart as a whip, just married herself a fine doctor. Always knew she'd make something of herself." The crowd murmured appreciative approval as Emma blushed and squeezed Marcus's hand. "And my boy Jake took over the family construction business. Doubled our profits in 2 years. That's my son right there." The applause was warm, genuine. Jake had always been the golden child, the one who could swing a hammer and charm a client in the same breath. Dad's chest puffed with pride as he clapped Jake on the shoulder, the picture of paternal satisfaction. But then his eyes found me again, and I felt that old familiar chill run down my spine. "And then there's my youngest, Rebecca." The pause was deliberate, practiced. He'd perfected this timing over years of family gatherings, church potlucks, and neighborhood barbecues. Bless her heart, this one's been our little wanderer. Can't seem to settle down. Can't figure out what she wants to do with her life. The laughter started, small, uncertain chuckles from family friends who weren't sure if they were supposed to find this funny. But Dad had momentum now, and he rode it like a wave. "Y'all remember when she tried to join the softball team in high school? Struck out every single time at bat. Coach finally put her in right field where the ball never goes, and she still managed to trip over her own feet chasing a pop fly." The memory hit me like a physical blow. I was 15 again, grass stains on my uniform, tears burning my eyes as Dad retold the story to anyone who would listen. Except, that wasn't how it happened. I'd actually caught that fly ball, made the winning play. But truth had never been Dad's strong suit when there was a laugh to be earned. "Then she decided she was going to be a nurse," he continued, warming up to his audience. "Lasted about 6 months before she realized she couldn't handle the sight of blood. After that it was teaching, but apparently 8-year-olds were too much for her to handle too." More laughter now, bolder, as people settled into the rhythm of his storytelling. My throat tightened. I'd left nursing school because I'd been accepted to the Naval Academy, a fact I'd tried to share with him over dinner one night. He'd barely looked up from his meatloaf, dismissing it as another one of Rebecca's pipe dreams. The teaching comment stung worse because it wasn't even true. I'd never tried to be a teacher, but Dad had never let facts interfere with a good story. "These past few years, she's been off playing soldier," Dad said, air quotes around the words like they were a joke in themselves. "Joined the Navy because she saw some recruiting commercial that made it look like summer camp. We figured she'd be back home within a month, asking for her old room back." The word playing hit me like a slap. Playing soldier. As if the sand of Afghanistan was a sandbox. As if the weight of command was make-believe. As if the nights I'd held dying Marines in my arms were just elaborate games of pretend. My hands clenched in my lap, knuckles white against the navy blue of my dress. "But give her credit," Dad continued, building to his crescendo. "She's persistent, I'll say that, even if she doesn't know what she's persisting at." The laughter was full-throated now, rolling across the reception hall like thunder. "Still, she managed to show up tonight looking respectable, so I guess that's progress." I felt my mother's hand brush mine under the table, a gentle touch that said both, "I'm sorry," and "please don't make a scene." Mom had perfected the art of damage control over 35 years of marriage to a man who confused humiliation with humor. Her eyes pleaded with me to let it pass, to smile and nod and play my part in his performance. Emma was staring at her bouquet, cheeks flushed with embarrassment that should have been Dad's, not hers. This was supposed to be her perfect day, and here he was using it as another opportunity to tear me down. Jake met my eyes across the table, his expression unreadable. He'd never intervened before, and I didn't expect him to start now. "So here's to my Rebecca," Dad concluded, raising his glass high. "The girl who's still figuring it out at 32. Better late than never, right, sweetheart?" The toast hung in the air like smoke, bitter and choking. 200 faces turned toward me, expecting me to smile, to laugh along, to play the good sport one more time. I could feel their pity, their secondhand embarrassment, their relief that they weren't the target of his casual cruelty. But something had shifted inside me during those words. Maybe it was the way he'd dismissed 13 years of service as playing soldier. Or maybe it was seeing Emma's joy tainted by his need to be the center of attention. Maybe I was just tired of being his punchline. For the first time in my life, I didn't smile, I didn't laugh, I didn't play along. I simply sat there, my champagne untouched, and let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. Dad's smile wavered slightly as he waited for my response, for the dutiful chuckle that would let him know his joke had landed. When it didn't come, his eyes narrowed with the first hint of uncertainty I'd ever seen there. The moment stretched like a wire-pulled taut, and I found myself thinking about the last time I'd been home, 8 months ago for Christmas. I'd been in uniform then, fresh from a deployment, and he'd made jokes about me playing dress-up to the neighbors. Mrs. Patterson from next door had asked politely about my service, and Dad had laughed it off. "Oh, you know kids these days, they'll try anything to avoid getting a real job." That night, I'd lain in my childhood bedroom, staring at the ceiling with its glow-in-the-dark stars Jake had put up when we were kids, and made myself a promise. This would be the last time. The last family gathering where I let him turn me into his entertainment. The last time I would sit silent while he rewrote my story to get a laugh. Now, 8 months later, as the reception hall waited for my response to his toast, I remembered that promise. And for the first time in 32 years, I decided to keep it. The silence had gone on long enough that people were starting to shift in their seats, glancing between Dad and me with growing discomfort. Emma reached for her water glass, clearly searching for a way to break the tension. Marcus, bless him, was looking around the room with the expression of a man who'd walked into a family dynamic he didn't understand, and wasn't sure he wanted to. That's when I heard the voice from the back of the room, cutting through the awkward quiet like a blade through silk. "Wait a minute," the voice said, and every head in the room turned toward its source. "Are you Rebecca Chen? Admiral Rebecca Chen?" The question hung in the air like a bomb with the pin pulled. I felt my breath catch as I recognized the speaker, a young man in a navy dress uniform, standing near the entrance with 3 other service members I hadn't noticed before. They must have arrived late, slipping.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
During Dad's speech. "Did he just say Admiral?" Someone whispered from the middle of the room. Dad's face went through a series of expressions in rapid succession. Confusion, disbelief, and then something that looked like panic. His bourbon glass paused halfway to his lips as he stared at the young officer, then at me, then back at the officer again. "I'm sorry," Dad said, forcing a laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "I think there's been some kind of mistake. This is my daughter Rebecca, and she's just—" "No mistake, sir," the officer interrupted, his voice carrying the kind of authority that makes rooms go quiet. "Admiral Chen, ma'am, I'm Lieutenant Commander Peterson. We served together on the USS Constellation. It's an honor to see you again." The room erupted in whispers. I could hear fragments of conversation rippling through the crowd like water through a broken dam. "Admiral? She's an admiral? Oh my God, she's a flag officer." Emma's bouquet slipped from her hands and scattered white roses across the floor. Jake's mouth had fallen open in a way that would have been comical under different circumstances. Mom's eyes were wide, one hand pressed to her chest as if she were trying to keep her heart from beating out of it. But it was Dad's face that held my attention. The color had drained from his cheeks, leaving him pale beneath his tan. His politician's smile had cracked completely, replaced by an expression of dawning horror as the magnitude of his mistake became clear. "Admiral?" he repeated weakly, the word coming out like a question he was afraid to have answered. I stood slowly, smoothing down my dress with hands that were steadier than they had any right to be. 13 years of command training had taught me how to project calm in a crisis, and this certainly qualified. Every eye in the room was on me now, but for the first time in my life I wasn't afraid of their attention. "Yes," I said simply, my voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent room. "I am." The confirmation hit the room like a physical force. I heard someone gasp, chairs scraping as people turned to get a better look at me, the soft thud of someone dropping their phone. Near the dessert table, my great-aunt Martha clutched her pearls and whispered something that sounded like a prayer. Lieutenant Commander Peterson stepped forward, his fellow officers flanking him with military precision. "Ma'am, if I may," he said, and without waiting for a response, he called out in a voice that could have reached the back of an aircraft carrier. "Attention on deck!" The 4 officers snapped to attention in perfect unison, their salute crisp and unwavering. The sound of their heels clicking together echoed through the silent room like gunshots. And in that moment, surrounded by wedding decorations and half-eaten cake, with my father's cruel words still hanging in the air, I received the recognition that 13 years of service had earned me. I returned their salute with the same precision I'd practiced 10,000 times before, my hand moving to my brow in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. But this time felt different. This time, I wasn't saluting in some far-off command center or on the deck of a ship thousands of miles from home. This time, I was saluting in front of everyone who had ever doubted me, ever dismissed me, ever laughed at Dad's jokes about his disappointing youngest daughter. "As you were," I said quietly, and the officers dropped their salutes but remained at attention. The room was so quiet I could hear the ice melting in abandoned glasses, the distant sound of traffic through the windows, my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. Dad stood frozen at the head table, his bourbon glass forgotten in his hand, staring at me like I was a stranger who had somehow taken his daughter's place. "I don't understand," he said finally, his voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. "You're an admiral? How is that possible?" The question hung between us like a bridge I could choose to cross or burn. For 13 years I'd sent letters that went unanswered, made phone calls that lasted 5 minutes, shared news that was met with polite disinterest. For 13 years I'd tried to make him see me, really see me, and he'd chosen not to. "It's been possible for 2 years, Dad," I said, my voice steady despite the emotions churning in my chest. "Since my promotion ceremony in Norfolk. You would have known that if you'd ever asked about my career instead of making jokes about it." The words landed like physical blows. I saw him flinch, saw the exact moment when the reality of what he'd done, what he'd always done, crashed into his consciousness like a wave against rocks. "But you never said," he started, then stopped, because we both knew that wasn't true. I had said. I'd tried to say. He just hadn't listened. Emma found her voice first. "Rebecca," she whispered, and I could hear tears in the word. "I had no idea. I'm so sorry, I had no idea." "It's not your fault," I told her gently. "It's your wedding day. It should be about you and Marcus, not about this." But even as I said it, I knew there was no going back to the way the evening had been before. The spell had been broken. The careful fiction Dad had constructed about his disappointment of a daughter shattered beyond repair. The room buzzed with whispered conversations as guests processed what they'd just witnessed, their voices a low hum of shock and recognition. I thought about all the times I'd sat in this same position, at birthday parties and graduation dinners, at Christmas mornings and Easter brunches, listening to Dad hold court with his stories about his successful children and his one failure. I thought about the years I'd spent believing those stories myself, wondering if maybe he was right, maybe I was the screw-up he said I was. Now, standing in this reception hall with the weight of my rank invisible but present, I finally understood something that had taken me 32 years to learn. The stories we tell about ourselves matter, but the stories others tell about us only have the power we give them. And I was done giving Dad that power. The young officer who had started this earthquake was still standing at attention, waiting for permission to speak. I nodded to him, and he relaxed slightly. "Ma'am, if I may," he said. The Admiral's leadership during Operation Desert Shield was legendary in the fleet. She saved 17 lives during the evacuation of Kandahar, and her innovations in naval logistics are still being taught at the War College. Each word hit the room like another revelation. I could see the guests processing this information, trying to reconcile the woman standing before them with the disappointing daughter Dad had been describing for years. Near the back, I spotted my high school softball coach, her mouth hanging open in recognition of just how wrong she'd been about my athletic abilities. 17 lives. Someone repeated in a whisper that carried despite its softness. Dad's glass finally slipped from his fingers, hitting the floor with a sharp crack that made everyone jump. Bourbon spread across the polished wood like spilled truth, dark and impossible to take back. He stared at the mess for a moment, then at me, and I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Genuine fear. Not fear of me, but fear of the reckoning that was coming. Fear of having to face what he'd done, what he'd said, what he'd chosen not to see. For 32 years, he'd been the narrator of my story, and now suddenly, dramatically, he'd lost that authority. I think, I said quietly, my voice carrying despite its gentleness, it's time for me to tell my own story. The room leaned forward collectively, drawn by the promise of truth after years of fiction. And for the first time in my life, I had their complete attention not as the butt of a joke, but as the hero of my own narrative. But that story, the real story of how a small-town girl who couldn't hit a softball became an admiral in the United States Navy, would have to start at the beginning. And the beginning was a long way from this reception hall, in a childhood where I learned that love could hurt, and that sometimes the people who are supposed to believe in you are the first ones to give up. I looked at Dad one more time, seeing him clearly perhaps for the first time, not as the larger-than-life figure who had dominated my childhood, but as a man who had chosen comfort over curiosity, laughter over love, easy stories over complicated truths. He looked smaller now, diminished by the reality of what I'd become, despite his expectations. Not because of them. The officers were still standing at attention, waiting for my command. The room was still holding its breath, waiting for my story. And Dad was still staring at me like I was a ghost of his own making, waiting for forgiveness he hadn't earned and didn't know how to ask for. But some stories need time to unfold properly, and this one had been 13 years in the making. As I stood there in my simple navy dress, surrounded by the wreckage of Dad's narrative and the birth of my own, I knew that what happened next would change everything between us forever. The question was whether it would change it for the better, or whether some bridges, once burned, can never be rebuilt. Only time would tell, but for now, for this moment, I was finally ready to be the author of my own story. And it was going to be a story worth telling. The story of how I became Admiral Rebecca Chen didn't begin with any grand revelation or sudden calling. It started in a small town in Oregon, where rain fell 9 months out of the year, and everyone knew everyone else's business, except, apparently, mine. Growing up in Millfield was like living in a snow globe that someone had forgotten to shake. Everything static and predictable, the same faces appearing in the same places year after year. Our house sat on Maple Street, a modest 2-story with blue shutters that Mom repainted every 3 years, whether they needed it or not. Dad ran Chen Construction, a business my grandfather had started with nothing but a pickup truck and stubborn determination. The irony of inheriting a construction company with the name Chen wasn't lost on anyone, least of all Dad, who had legally changed his name from Patterson when he married Mom, claiming it sounded more distinctive for business purposes. What he really meant was that David Chen sounded more exotic than David Patterson, in a town where exotic meant adding soy sauce to your stir-fry. Jake was born first, arriving into the world with Dad's square jaw and an apparent understanding that he was destined to carry on the family legacy. Even as a toddler, he could hold a toy hammer correctly, and by age 5 he was following Dad around job sites, wearing a miniature hard hat and asking intelligent questions about load-bearing beams. He was everything Dad had hoped for in a son, mechanically inclined, naturally charismatic, and blessed with the kind of confidence that made people want to follow him. Emma came next, 3 years later, with Mom's gentle eyes and an innate sense of how to make people feel comfortable. She floated through childhood like she was born, knowing the rules of every social situation, always saying the right thing at the right time, never causing waves or making anyone uncomfortable. Teachers loved her, other parents wished their daughters were more like her, and she seemed destined for the kind of quiet success that made everyone proud without making anyone nervous. Then there was me, arriving 4 years after Emma like an afterthought nobody had planned for. From the beginning, I was the one who didn't quite fit the pattern. Where Jake was mechanically gifted, I took apart radios just to see how they worked, and usually couldn't put them back together. Where Emma was socially graceful, I asked too many questions and pointed out inconsistencies that made adults uncomfortable. Where both of them seemed to instinctively understand what Dad wanted from them, I spent my childhood feeling like I was speaking a language he didn't recognize. The early signs of my differentness were subtle at first. While Jake built elaborate Lego constructions that looked like actual buildings, I built sprawling cities with detailed backstories about the imaginary people who lived there. While Emma played house and took care of her dolls with maternal precision, I was more interested in the physics of why the toy stove made clicking sounds when you turned the knobs. I wasn't rebellious exactly, just curious in ways that seemed to make everyone around me slightly nervous. School became my first real arena of disappointment. Not because I wasn't smart. My grades were actually quite good, but because I was smart in ways that didn't translate to the kind of achievements Dad understood. When Jake brought home trophies from Little League, Dad would display them on the mantle like sacred objects. When Emma won the spelling bee in 4th grade, he called his business partners to brag. When I won the science fair with a project about solar panel efficiency, he glanced at it briefly and asked why I couldn't have done something more practical, like studying how to build better birdhouses. The softball incident Dad had referenced at the wedding was typical of how my childhood memories had been systematically rewritten over the years. The truth was that I'd actually been quite good at softball, good enough to make the varsity team as a sophomore. But I'd made the mistake of questioning Coach Williams' strategy during a particularly frustrating game where we were down by 8 runs, and he kept having us bunt instead of swinging away. I'd suggested, politely I thought, that maybe we needed to take some risks if we wanted to catch up. Coach Williams had not appreciated my strategic input from a 15-year-old, and when I'd persisted in offering suggestions, he'd benched me for, quote, attitude problems. Rather than ask my side of the story, Dad had simply accepted the coach's version that I was difficult to work with and had been dropped from the team for not being a team player. By the time the story reached family dinners, it had morphed into me striking out every time at bat and tripping over my own feet in right field. That pattern of revisionist history became a constant in my teenage years. When I quit the debate team after the coach made it clear he wasn't interested in hearing ideas from underclassmen, it became, quote, Rebecca couldn't handle the pressure of competition. When I left the drama club because the director insisted on casting based on whose parents donated the most money rather than who auditioned best, it became, quote, Rebecca couldn't take criticism about her acting. The truth was always more complicated than Dad's versions, but complicated truths didn't make for good dinner party stories. Simple narratives about his youngest daughter who, quote, couldn't stick with anything were much easier to digest, especially when they got laughs and sympathetic nods from other parents who were grateful their own children weren't the problem. High school was where the pattern really solidified. Jake was the star quarterback who could have played college ball if he hadn't been more interested in learning the business. Emma was homecoming princess, honor society president, and bound for a prestigious pre-med program. And I was the one who earned good grades but somehow never managed to distinguish myself in ways that mattered to Dad. Part of the problem was that my interests lay in areas he simply didn't value. While Jake was learning about foundations and electrical systems, I was fascinated by logistics and systems theory. While Emma was volunteering at the hospital and shadowing Dr. Morrison on his rounds, I was reading biographies of military leaders and studying how complex organizations managed to function under pressure. I discovered military history almost by accident, picking up a biography of Admiral Grace Hopper from the library's biography section when I was 14. I'd been drawn initially by the novelty of a woman admiral, but what captivated me was the description of how she'd revolutionized naval computing systems during World War II. Here was someone who'd taken complex technical problems and created elegant solutions that saved lives and won battles. It was the kind of systematic thinking that appealed to me in ways that traditional feminine pursuits never had. From Admiral Hopper, I'd moved on to other military leaders, both historical and contemporary. I read about Dwight Eisenhower's organizational genius in planning D-Day, about Colin Powell's rise through the ranks despite facing discrimination, about the complex logistics of keeping carrier groups supplied thousands of miles from home. I was fascinated by the idea of institutions where competence mattered more than connections, where your value was measured by your ability to get things done under pressure, rather than your ability to charm people at cocktail parties. But when I tried to share these interests with Dad, his reaction was always the same mixture of bewilderment and mild concern. Military service was something other people's children did, usually because they couldn't afford college or didn't have better options. The idea that his daughter might voluntarily choose such a path was as foreign to him as if I'd announced my intention to become a circus performer. The disconnect became more pronounced as I got older, and my interests more focused. When other girls my age were thinking about prom dresses and college majors, I was reading Jane's Fighting Ships and studying organizational charts of military command structures. When my classmates were stressing about SAT scores and college applications, I was researching the Naval Academy and trying to understand what it would take to get an appointment. I was careful not to mention this research at home, having learned from experience that Dad's response to my unconventional interests was usually some variation of, "Why can't you be more like your sister?" Instead, I kept my military fascination to myself, checking out books from the public library instead of the school library, to avoid questions from guidance counselors who might mention my reading habits to my parents. This secrecy became a habit that extended to other areas of my life. When I started running at 5 in the morning to build the kind of physical fitness I thought military service would require, I told my parents I was trying to lose weight. When I began teaching myself basic electronics and radio operation, I claimed it was for a science project. When I started studying leadership theory and organizational psychology, I said it was because I was thinking about majoring in business. None of these explanations were entirely false, but they weren't the whole truth either. The whole truth was that I was systematically preparing myself for a career I couldn't discuss with my family, because I knew they wouldn't understand. Dad had spent my entire childhood making it clear that my interests and instincts were somehow wrong, that I needed to be more like Emma or more like Jake or more like anyone other than who I actually was. Senior year brought the inevitable conversations about college and career plans. Jake had already been accepted to Oregon State's business program and would be working part-time for Dad throughout college, essentially serving an extended apprenticeship that would prepare him to take over Chen Construction when Dad retired. Emma had been accepted to pre-med at Portland State and was already talking about specializing in pediatrics, a choice that made everyone beam with pride. When it came to my turn in these family planning sessions, I found myself trapped between honesty and self-preservation. I'd been accepted to several good schools with solid ROTC programs, and I'd been working with a Navy recruiter who thought I had excellent potential for officer training. But I knew that mentioning any of this would trigger the kind of family crisis I wasn't prepared to handle. Instead, I mumbled something about studying international relations and keeping my options open. It wasn't technically a lie. International relations was exactly what military officers dealt with, just not in the way Dad imagined. He seemed satisfied with this vague answer, probably because international relations sounded like something Emma might study, something safely academic and respectable. The Naval Academy application was something I completed in secret, using the school library computers and asking teachers I trusted for recommendations without explaining exactly what they were for. The whole process felt like conducting an undercover operation in my own life, which, in retrospect, was probably good preparation for the actual military service that would follow. When the appointment came through in March of my senior year, I stared at the letter for 15 minutes before the reality of it sank in. Here was my ticket to the life I'd been imagining, the chance to prove that all those hours of study and preparation had been worth something. But it was also the moment when I would have to tell my family the truth about who I really was and what I really wanted. I chose the wrong moment, of course. Dad was in one of his expansive moods, holding court at Sunday dinner with stories about Jake's latest achievements and Emma's acceptance to med school. He was in the middle of describing how proud he was to have raised such accomplished children when I cleared my throat and announced that I had news too. "I've been accepted to the Naval Academy," I said, the words coming out in a rush before I could lose my nerve. "I'll be commissioned as an officer after graduation." The silence that followed was the kind of complete quiet that only happens when someone has said something so unexpected that it takes time for others to process what they've heard. Dad's fork remained suspended halfway to his mouth, a piece of pot roast balanced precariously on the tines. Mom's hand flew to her throat in a gesture I'd seen her make when she was trying not to say something she'd regret. Emma and Jake exchanged glances across the table like they were witnessing something that couldn't possibly be real. "The Naval Academy?" Dad repeated finally, setting down his fork with deliberate care. "As in the Military Naval Academy." "Yes," I said, trying to project more confidence than I felt. "It's extremely competitive. Only about 1,200 people are accepted each year, out of thousands of applicants." "But why?" Mom asked, her voice small and confused. "You never said anything about being interested in the military." That stung because it was both true and completely unfair. I'd never said anything about being interested in the military because I'd learned early that my interests weren't the kind that got positive responses in our family. I'd learned to keep quiet about the things that excited me because excitement was apparently something to be managed rather than encouraged. "I've been interested for a while," I said carefully. "I think I'd be good at it." Dad's laugh was the sound I'd been dreading, the particular chuckle he reserved for my most impractical ideas. "Honey, you can't even keep your room clean. What makes you think you can handle military discipline?" It was such a perfectly dad response that I almost laughed myself. Here I was, telling him about one of the most competitive educational opportunities in the country, and his first thought was about my occasionally messy bedroom. It crystallized everything that was wrong with how he saw me, not as someone with potential to be developed, but as someone with problems to be managed. "It's not the same thing," I said, knowing even as I spoke that I was wasting my breath. "Military discipline is about mission accomplishment and taking care of people. It's about something bigger than yourself." "And you think that's what you want?" Dad asked, his tone making it clear that he thought no such thing. "Rebecca, you've never stuck with anything long enough to see it through. What happens when this gets difficult and you want to quit like everything else?" The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had been burning for years. This was the core of how Dad saw me, as someone who quit when things got hard, someone who couldn't be trusted to follow through on commitments. It didn't matter that I'd actually quit things because they weren't right for me, not because they were difficult. It didn't matter that I'd shown plenty of persistence when working toward goals that mattered to me. In Dad's narrative, I was the quitter, and quitters didn't belong in the military. "I'm not gonna quit," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "This is what I want to do with my life." "What you want to do," Dad repeated, shaking his head with that familiar mixture of amusement and exasperation. "Rebecca, what you want changes every 6 months. Last year you wanted to be a veterinarian. Before that it was something with computers. Now it's the military. What's it going to be next year?" Each example hit like a physical blow because they were all true and all misleading at the same time. I had been interested in veterinary medicine until I'd discovered that modern veterinary practice was more about running a small business than helping animals. I had been fascinated by computer programming until I'd realized that most programming jobs involved maintaining other people's boring corporate software rather than creating anything innovative. But Dad had never asked why I'd lost interest in these things. He'd simply filed each change of direction as more evidence of my fundamental unreliability. "This is different," I said, knowing how weak it sounded even as I said it. "That's what you always say," Dad replied, his tone gentle but firm, like he was explaining something to a child who couldn't quite grasp a simple concept. "Look, honey, I understand you think you want adventure or whatever, but the military isn't summer camp. It's a serious commitment, and frankly, I don't think you're ready for that kind of responsibility." The words landed like a verdict from a judge who'd already made up his mind. In Dad's worldview, responsibility was something you earned through years of demonstrating reliability in conventional ways. Since I'd never shown interest in conventional paths, I clearly hadn't earned the right to attempt unconventional ones. Mom tried to bridge the gap with her usual diplomatic approach. "Maybe you could do ROTC in college," she suggested. Test the waters before making such a big commitment. It was a reasonable suggestion from her perspective, but it missed the point entirely. I didn't want to test the waters. I wanted to dive in completely. To commit myself fully to something I believed in, rather than hedging my bets with half measures. But explaining that would require explaining why I felt so sure about something I'd never actually done, and I didn't have words for that kind of certainty. The conversation eventually petered out into uncomfortable silence, with Dad making it clear that while he couldn't stop me from accepting the appointment, he thought I was making a terrible mistake that I'd regret within a year. Emma tried to be supportive in her careful way, but I could see the worry in her eyes. Jake just looked confused, like I'd announced my intention to move to Mars. The rest of senior year passed in a strange, suspended state. Outwardly, nothing much changed. I continued going to classes and doing homework and participating in family dinners, as though everything was normal. But underneath, I felt like I was living in two different worlds simultaneously. The world where I was Rebecca Chen, the disappointment daughter who couldn't stick with anything, and the world where I was Midshipman Chen, future naval officer with unlimited potential. The Naval Academy sent packages of information about what to expect, what to bring, what kind of physical and mental preparation I should be doing. I read everything they sent with the kind of careful attention I'd never given to college brochures or career guidance materials. This felt real in a way that nothing else ever had, like I was finally moving towards something instead of just moving away from things that didn't fit. Dad's attitude toward my impending departure was complex and contradictory. On one hand, he seemed genuinely worried about me, concerned that I was setting myself up for failure in a way that would be more devastating than my usual pattern of losing interest and moving on. On the other hand, I sensed a part of him that was almost looking forward to being proved right, to having his prediction of my inability to handle military discipline validated by my inevitable return home with my tail between my legs. The night before I left for Annapolis, Dad sat me down for what he clearly intended to be a serious father-daughter conversation. We were in his study, surrounded by the trophies and certificates that documented the family's various achievements. Jake's football awards dominated one wall, Emma's academic honors covered another, and my own sparse collection of science fair ribbons and honor roll certificates occupied a small corner that somehow made them look even more insignificant. "Rebecca," Dad said, settling back in his leather chair with the air of a man about to dispense important wisdom, "I want you to know that no matter what happens, you'll always have a home here. When this military thing doesn't work out, and I'm not saying that to be cruel, but when it doesn't work out, you can come back and we'll figure out what's next." He meant it kindly, I knew that. In his mind, he was offering me a safety net, a way to fail gracefully without losing face completely. But what I heard was his absolute certainty that I would fail. His complete inability to imagine a scenario where I might actually succeed at something he didn't understand. "Thanks, Dad," I said, because there was nothing else to say. "I appreciate that. I just don't want you to be too hard on yourself when you realize this isn't what you thought it would be," he continued. "Military life is tough, tougher than you've ever experienced. There's no shame in admitting you made a mistake." I nodded and made appropriate responses, but inside I was making a different kind of promise to myself. I would not be coming home in failure. I would not be proving Dad right about my inability to stick with difficult things. Whatever it took, however hard it got, I would make this work. The drive to Portland to catch my flight east was quiet, filled with the kind of stilted conversation that happens when people don't know how to say goodbye properly. Dad drove, Mom sat in the passenger seat occasionally dabbing at her eyes, and I stared out the back window watching Oregon disappear behind us. At the airport, the goodbye was awkward and emotional in all the wrong ways. Mom cried, Dad gave me a hug that felt more like condolence than congratulations, and I walked through security feeling like I was escaping rather than embarking on an adventure. The flight to Baltimore was my first time traveling alone, my first time leaving the Pacific Northwest, my first time doing anything that felt genuinely adult and independent. As the plane lifted off and I watched the familiar landscape shrink below me, I felt a mixture of terror and exhilaration that I'd never experienced before. I was finally moving towards something I wanted rather than away from something I didn't. What I couldn't have known then was that the next 4 years would be the most difficult and transformative of my life, that I would be broken down and rebuilt in ways I couldn't imagine, that I would discover strengths I didn't know I possessed and capabilities I'd never been allowed to develop. I couldn't have known that Dad's prediction of my failure would become the fuel that drove me to succeed, that every moment of doubt would be answered by memories of his certainty that I wouldn't make it. Most importantly, I couldn't have known that by the time I graduated from the Naval Academy, I would be a completely different person from the uncertain girl who'd left Oregon with everyone expecting her to fail. The journey from midshipman to admiral would take 13 more years, but it began that day on the airplane, when I finally stopped trying to be who Dad wanted me to be and started becoming who I actually was. The first thing they do at the Naval Academy is strip away everything you think you know about yourself. Within hours of arriving at Bancroft Hall, I learned that my name was no longer Rebecca Chen. It was Midshipman Chen, spoken with the kind of sharp precision that cuts through any lingering sense of individual identity. The upperclassmen who processed us during induction day treated us like products on an assembly line, shouting commands that were designed to overwhelm and disorient, rather than merely instruct. My roommate was Maria Santos from San Antonio, a girl whose father had served 3 tours in Vietnam and whose brothers were both Marines. She understood military culture in ways I was still learning, knew when to speak and when to stay silent, moved with the kind of efficiency that comes from growing up in a household where discipline was a way of life, rather than an abstract concept. Watching her navigate those first weeks was like studying a masterclass in adaptation. The physical demands were brutal, but manageable. Years of early morning runs had prepared my body for the cardiovascular punishment, and the systematic approach to fitness appealed to the part of my mind that liked breaking complex problems down into manageable components. What I hadn't anticipated was the psychological pressure of being constantly evaluated, constantly judged, constantly found wanting in areas I'd never considered important. My first real crisis came during the 3rd week of plebe summer, when I was selected for additional instruction in military bearing. The upperclassman conducting the session was a first-class midshipman named Rodriguez, whose primary qualification seemed to be his ability to find fault with everything I did. My salute was too slow, my posture too relaxed, my responses too thoughtful when what was required was immediate compliance. "Chen," he barked during one particularly frustrating session. "What part of, 'Yes, sir,' don't you understand? This isn't a debating society. When I give you an order, you don't think about it, you don't analyze it, you execute it." The correction stung not because it was unfair, but because it highlighted a fundamental disconnect between how my mind worked and what military culture demanded. I'd spent my entire life being praised for thinking critically, for questioning assumptions, for approaching problems from multiple angles. Here, those very qualities were being identified as weaknesses that needed to be corrected. That night, lying in my narrow bunk while Maria breathed steadily in the bed across from me, I found myself thinking about Dad's prediction that I would quit when things got difficult. The temptation was real in a way I hadn't expected. Not because the physical demands were too much, but because the psychological adjustment required me to become someone fundamentally different from who I'd always been. But something had shifted in me during that conversation with Rodriguez. Instead of feeling defeated by his criticism, I found myself analyzing it like a problem to be solved. He wasn't attacking me personally. He was trying to teach me something important about how military organizations function under pressure. Individual initiative was valuable, but only within the context of disciplined teamwork. Critical thinking was essential, but it had to be balanced with the ability to follow orders, even when you didn't fully understand their purpose. The revelation that military discipline was actually a sophisticated form of leadership training, rather than simple authoritarianism, changed everything for me. Each correction became data to be processed. Each punishment became a lesson in how to maintain focus under stress. I began to see the academy not as a place that was trying to break me down, but as a place that was trying to build me up in ways I'd never experienced. Academic classes provided a different kind of challenge. The curriculum was demanding but intellectually stimulating in ways that reminded me why I'd been drawn to military service in the first place. Naval history classes taught me about the complex strategic thinking that went into major fleet operations. Engineering courses showed me how technological innovation could provide decisive advantages in combat situations. Leadership classes introduced me to theories about human motivation and organizational psychology that connected abstract concepts to practical applications. My favorite professor was Commander Sarah Mitchell, a surface warfare officer who taught naval tactics and strategy. She had the rare ability to make complex military concepts accessible without dumbing them down, and she encouraged the kind of analytical thinking that I'd been told to suppress in other contexts. During one memorable class discussion about the Battle of Midway, she asked us to consider how Admiral Nimitz had balanced incomplete intelligence with the need to take decisive action. Leadership isn't about having perfect information, Commander Mitchell explained, her eyes scanning the classroom with the intensity of someone who'd made life-and-death decisions under pressure. It's about making the best decisions possible with the information you have, while remaining flexible enough to adapt when circumstances change. The comment resonated with me in ways that extended far beyond military strategy. It was a framework for thinking about leadership that felt both practical and intellectually satisfying, a way of approaching complex problems that honored both careful analysis and decisive action. For the first time since arriving at the academy, I felt like I was learning something that connected directly to my natural instincts, rather than fighting against them. My academic performance was strong enough to earn recognition, but it was my performance during practical exercises that really set me apart. During a navigation exercise in Chesapeake Bay, our training squadron encountered unexpected weather that forced us to rely on backup instruments and dead reckoning rather than GPS systems. While other midshipmen struggled with the manual calculations required to maintain course, I found myself energized by the problem-solving challenge. The instructor, Lieutenant Commander Jackson, noticed my competence and assigned me additional responsibilities that tested my ability to coordinate with other crew members under pressure. When one of my classmates became seasick and couldn't perform his duties, I stepped in to handle both his responsibilities and mine without compromising the mission's success. "Chen," Lieutenant Commander Jackson said after we'd returned to port, "you've got good instincts for this kind of work. Have you given any thought to your service selection?" The question caught me off guard, because I hadn't really considered the specific path my naval career might take. I'd been so focused on simply surviving the academy that I hadn't thought much about what would come after graduation. But the experience on Chesapeake Bay had shown me something important about my own capabilities. I performed best when the stakes were high and the problems were complex. "I'm interested in surface warfare, sir," I heard myself saying. "I like the operational complexity." Lieutenant Commander Jackson nodded approvingly. "Surface warfare is challenging, but it's where you learn to handle real responsibility quickly. If you're serious about it, I can recommend some additional training opportunities that will help you prepare." The conversation marked a turning point in how I thought about my time at the academy. Instead of simply trying to meet minimum standards and avoid failure, I began actively seeking out challenges that would prepare me for fleet service. I volunteered for additional seamanship training, took elective courses in advanced navigation and communications, and spent my summer training periods on active-duty ships, where I could observe experienced officers in action. During my second-class summer cruise aboard the USS Hampton, a Los Angeles-class submarine, I encountered my first taste of what naval leadership looked like in practice. The submarine's commanding officer, Commander Lisa Park, was a woman who had risen through the ranks during a time when female officers faced significant barriers to advancement. Watching her manage the complex dynamics of submarine operations, while maintaining the respect and confidence of her crew, was like seeing a master craftsman at work. One evening, during a brief surface period in the middle of the Atlantic, Commander Park invited me to join her on the bridge. The ocean stretched endlessly in all directions, dark water meeting darker sky with only the stars to provide reference points. It was the kind of vast emptiness that could make you feel insignificant, but instead I felt connected to something larger and more important than anything I'd experienced before. "What do you think about when you look at this?" Commander Park asked, gesturing toward the horizon. "Responsibility?" I answered without really thinking about it. "All the people who depend on decisions made out here. All the consequences that ripple out from what happens on this ship." She nodded slowly, like I'd passed some kind of test I didn't know I was taking. "That's the right answer," she said. "A lot of officers get caught up in the technical aspects of naval operations, the engineering, the tactics, the procedures. But the real work of leadership is understanding that every decision you make affects real people in real ways." The insight stayed with me through the rest of my academy years and beyond. Military service wasn't just about following orders or executing missions. It was about taking responsibility for outcomes that mattered to people you might never meet. It was the kind of responsibility that couldn't be faked or performed for show. Either you accepted it completely, with all its weight and complexity, or you didn't belong in positions of command. My graduation from the Naval Academy was a moment of triumph that felt both deeply personal and strangely hollow. I'd proven to myself that I could succeed in an environment designed to challenge every assumption about my capabilities. My class rank was high enough to guarantee my preferred service assignment, and I'd earned the respect of instructors who had initially doubted my commitment. But when I looked out at the audience during the ceremony, I saw Mom and Emma cheering proudly while Dad sat with the polite but distant expression of someone attending an obligation rather than a celebration. He'd made the trip to Annapolis, which was more than I'd expected, but his presence felt more like grudging acknowledgement than genuine pride. During the brief reception afterward, he made appropriate comments about my achievement while somehow managing to convey that he still considered it an elaborate form of extended education rather than the beginning of a serious career. "So what happens next?" he asked, his tone suggesting genuine curiosity mixed with continued skepticism about my choices. "I'll be assigned to a destroyer based in Norfolk," I explained. "It's a 2-year assignment where I'll rotate through different departments to learn shipboard operations. And after that, it depends on my performance and what opportunities are available. The Navy invests a lot in officer development if you show potential for increased responsibility." Dad nodded politely, but I could see in his eyes that he was already calculating how long it might take for me to realize this career path wasn't what I'd expected, and return to more conventional pursuits. His doubt had become a familiar weight that I'd learned to carry without letting it affect my performance, but it still stung to see it so clearly displayed during what should have been a moment of uncomplicated celebration. My first assignment aboard the USS Fitzgerald was everything I'd hoped for, and more challenging than I'd imagined. As the most junior officer on the ship, I was assigned to the supply department under Lieutenant Commander Rebecca Walsh, a surface warfare officer who had earned a reputation for developing junior officers while maintaining the highest standards for performance. Ship life was like living inside a complex machine, where every person had multiple responsibilities, and every action had consequences that rippled through interconnected systems. My initial assignment in supply taught me how naval operations depended on countless logistical details that had to be managed with precision and foresight. Food, fuel, spare parts, ammunition, mail, medical supplies. Every item that came aboard had to be tracked, stored, and distributed according to procedures that seemed bureaucratic until you understood how quickly things could go wrong without proper oversight. The work was demanding but intellectually satisfying in ways I hadn't anticipated. Managing the ship's inventory required the kind of systematic thinking I'd always enjoyed, but with the added pressure of knowing that mistakes could affect the crew's ability to complete their mission. When we deployed to the Persian Gulf 6 months after I reported aboard, the theoretical aspects of supply management became immediate and concrete. During my second rotation, I was assigned to the operations department, where I learned about the tactical side of naval warfare. Standing watch in the Combat Information Center during training exercises was like playing a 3-dimensional chess game, where the pieces moved in real time and the stakes were measured in lives rather than points. Radar contacts had to be identified and tracked, communications had to be maintained with other ships and aircraft, and tactical decisions had to be made based on incomplete information under time pressure. The first time I stood officer of the deck underway, I felt the full weight of command responsibility in a way that no classroom exercise could simulate. Every decision about course and speed, every communication with other ships, every response to changing conditions was mine to make with the knowledge that hundreds of lives depended on my competence and judgment. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. My performance evaluations during those early years were consistently strong, but what set me apart was my ability to see connections between different aspects of ship operations that other officers often missed. When we experienced a recurring problem with communications equipment during exercises, I was the one who noticed that the failures coincided with specific fuel consumption patterns that suggested engine vibrations were affecting sensitive electronic components. The investigation that followed my observation led to modifications in equipment mounting procedures that were eventually adopted fleet-wide. It was a small contribution in the grand scheme of naval operations, but it demonstrated the kind of analytical thinking that senior officers noticed and valued. Lieutenant Commander Walsh became my first real mentor in naval service, someone who understood both my strengths and the areas where I needed development. During one of our regular counseling sessions, she offered advice that would shape my approach to leadership for the rest of my career. "Chen, you've got excellent technical skills and strong analytical abilities," she said, reviewing my performance evaluation before submitting it to the captain. "But if you want to advance to senior positions, you need to develop your ability to influence people, not just solve problems." The distinction was important and not immediately obvious to me. I'd assumed that competence would naturally lead to leadership opportunities, that people would follow someone who consistently made good decisions and solved difficult problems. What I was learning was that leadership required a different set of skills that complemented technical competence but went far beyond it. Lieutenant Commander Walsh arranged for me to attend a leadership development course at the Surface Warfare Officers School that focused specifically on the human dynamics of command. The course material covered topics like motivation theory, conflict resolution, and communication strategies that seemed almost like psychology courses rather than military training. One exercise that particularly challenged me involved leading a team of fellow officers through a simulated crisis scenario, where technical solutions were less important than the ability to coordinate different personalities under pressure. My natural inclination was to focus on the tactical problem that needed to be solved, but the real challenge was managing the interpersonal dynamics that could either enhance or undermine the team's effectiveness. Leadership isn't about being the smartest person in the room, the instructor, Commander James Wilson, explained during the debrief. It's about creating conditions where everyone can contribute their best work toward a common goal. Sometimes that means stepping back and letting others take the lead in areas where they have more expertise. The insight was humbling but valuable. I'd spent so much time proving that I could handle technical challenges that I'd sometimes overlooked the equally important work of building relationships and fostering teamwork. Military effectiveness depended on both individual competence and collective cooperation, and senior officers needed to excel at both. My second assignment was to the USS Cole, an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, where I served as the communications officer under Captain Patricia Rodriguez, one of the most respected surface warfare officers in the fleet. Captain Rodriguez had a reputation for developing junior officers while maintaining extremely high standards for performance, and serving under her command was considered both an honor and a significant professional challenge. The Cole was preparing for deployment to the Mediterranean when I reported aboard, which meant intensive training and evaluation periods that tested every aspect of the ship's readiness for combat operations. My responsibilities as communications officer placed me at the center of nearly every operational activity, from coordinating with other ships and aircraft to managing the flow of information between different departments within the ship. During a particularly complex multi-ship exercise off the Virginia coast, we encountered a scenario that tested not just our technical capabilities, but our ability to adapt to rapidly changing circumstances. Intelligence reports indicated potential terrorist activity in our operating area, which required us to maintain heightened alertness while continuing our training objectives. I was standing watch as officer of the deck when we received an urgent communication from Fleet Headquarters warning of a possible small boat attack. The warning was based on intelligence that was both credible and vague, which meant we needed to take protective measures without knowing exactly what threat we might be facing or when it might materialize. Captain Rodriguez was on the bridge within minutes of receiving the warning, but she made it clear that I would continue to handle the immediate response while she monitored and provided guidance as needed. It was the kind of situation that could either demonstrate readiness for increased responsibility or reveal limitations that weren't apparent during routine operations. The next 4 hours were among the most intense of my naval career up to that point. Coordinating with other ships to establish defensive positions, managing communications with shore-based intelligence sources, maintaining readiness for potential combat action, and keeping the crew informed and focused required every leadership skill I'd developed, plus some I was learning in real time. The threat eventually proved to be based on intelligence that couldn't be confirmed, and we returned to normal training operations without any actual contact with hostile forces. But the exercise had demonstrated something important about my ability to handle complex, high-pressure situations where technical competence had to be combined with sound judgment and effective communication. Captain Rodriguez's evaluation of my performance during that exercise was the most positive feedback I'd received in my naval career. More importantly, she recommended me for early promotion and assignment to a position of increased responsibility that would accelerate my career development. Chen, you've demonstrated the kind of judgment and leadership ability that the Navy needs in senior positions, she wrote in my fitness report. I strongly recommend her for immediate advancement to positions of increased responsibility and continued professional development. The recommendation led to my selection for the Naval War College, an assignment that was both an honor and a significant responsibility. The War College provided advanced education in strategic thinking and operational planning that prepared officers for the kind of senior positions where individual decisions could affect entire fleets or regional operations. My thesis at the War College focused on logistics innovations that could improve the Navy's ability to maintain operations in contested environments far from established supply bases. The research required me to study both historical examples and contemporary challenges, analyzing how technological advances could be integrated with operational concepts to create new capabilities. The work was intellectually demanding in ways that reminded me why I'd been drawn to naval service in the first place. Here was an environment where analytical thinking was not just valued, but essential, where the ability to synthesize complex information and develop innovative solutions was considered a core professional skill. My thesis advisor, Captain Michael Thompson, was a strategist who had served in senior positions during several major naval operations. Working with him provided insights into how strategic concepts were translated into operational reality, and how senior officers balanced competing priorities and limited resources to achieve complex objectives. The mark of effective naval leadership, Captain Thompson explained during one of our thesis discussions, is the ability to see both the immediate tactical situation and the broader strategic context. Junior officers focus on executing their assigned tasks competently. Senior officers focus on understanding how their decisions fit into larger patterns that determine success or failure. The distinction was crucial for understanding how to prepare for senior leadership positions. Technical competence would always be important, but strategic thinking required a different kind of intellectual framework that considered multiple variables and long-term consequences, rather than just immediate problems and solutions. Upon graduation from the War College, I was assigned as operations officer aboard the USS Princeton, a Ticonderoga-class cruiser that served as flagship for a destroyer squadron deployed to the Western Pacific. The assignment represented a significant increase in responsibility and placed me in a position where my decisions directly affected not just one ship, but an entire group of vessels operating together. The Western Pacific deployment was my first extended assignment in a region where tensions between major powers created the constant possibility of confrontation. Our mission was to maintain freedom of navigation in international waters while demonstrating American commitment to regional allies, which required both tactical competence and diplomatic sensitivity. During one particularly tense period, we were operating near the South China Sea when intelligence reports indicated increased Chinese military activity in disputed waters. Our orders were to maintain our planned course and schedule while avoiding any actions that could be interpreted as provocative, a balance that required careful judgment about how to respond to various scenarios that might develop. I was serving as tactical action officer when we encountered a Chinese naval formation that was conducting what appeared to be training exercises in our planned operating area. The situation required immediate decisions about how to proceed without either backing down from our legitimate operations or escalating tensions unnecessarily. The Chinese ships maintained professional behavior throughout our encounter, but their presence clearly demonstrated their claim to waters that we considered international. How we responded would send signals not just to the Chinese forces, but to allied nations watching to see whether American commitments to freedom of navigation were backed by actual resolve. Working with the squadron commander, Rear Admiral Patricia Hayes, I developed a response plan that maintained our operational objectives while demonstrating respect for legitimate Chinese interests and avoiding unnecessary confrontation. The plan required precise coordination between multiple ships and careful management of communications to ensure that our intentions were clearly understood by all parties. The successful completion of that deployment, and particularly my performance during the South China Sea incident, led to my selection for promotion to commander and assignment to the Pentagon as a strategic planner for Pacific Fleet operations. It was my first shore assignment in a position where I could directly influence the kind of high-level planning that determined how naval forces were employed around the world. Working at the Pentagon provided a completely different perspective on naval operations than anything I'd experienced on ships. Here, individual missions were planned within the context of broader strategic objectives that involved not just military considerations but diplomatic, economic, and political factors that affected American interests globally. My specific assignment was to develop operational concepts for maintaining naval superiority in the Western Pacific, despite growing Chinese military capabilities. The work required me to analyze intelligence reports, assess technological developments, and propose strategies that could maintain American influence in a region where the balance of power was shifting rapidly. The intellectual challenges were exactly the kind of complex problem-solving that I'd always enjoyed, but with stakes that extended far beyond individual ships or even single operations. The strategies I helped develop would influence how hundreds of ships and thousands of personnel were employed over periods of years, affecting everything from training priorities to shipbuilding programs. During my tour at the Pentagon, I worked closely with senior officers who were responsible for the highest levels of naval planning and strategy. Watching them balance competing priorities and manage complex interagency relationships provided insights into the kind of leadership required at flag officer level. Vice Admiral Sarah Martinez, who served as Director of Naval Plans and Policy, became another important mentor who helped me understand what preparation would be required for senior command positions. Her guidance was particularly valuable because she had navigated her own career through a period when opportunities for women in senior naval positions were more limited than they would become later. The key to success at senior levels, Admiral Martinez explained during one of our regular mentoring sessions, is developing the ability to operate effectively in environments where military considerations are only one part of much larger equations. Flag officers need to understand not just naval warfare, but diplomacy, economics, and domestic politics. Her advice influenced my approach to professional development during my remaining time at the Pentagon. I took graduate courses in international relations and strategic studies, attended conferences on defense policy and regional security issues, and sought out assignments that would broaden my understanding of how naval operations fit into larger national security strategies. The opportunity to put that broader perspective into practice came when I was selected for promotion to captain and assignment as commanding officer of the USS Shiloh, another Ticonderoga-class cruiser that would deploy to the Persian Gulf as part of a carrier strike group. Command at sea was the culmination of everything I'd worked towards since graduating from the Naval Academy. Every decision, every order, every response to changing conditions was my responsibility alone, backed by years of training and experience, but ultimately dependent on my judgment and leadership ability. My first deployment as commanding officer tested those capabilities in ways that no amount of training could fully simulate. We were operating in waters where Iranian naval forces regularly challenged American operations, requiring constant vigilance and the ability to respond to provocative actions without escalating tensions unnecessarily. During one memorable incident, Iranian fast boats approached our formation in a manner that suggested possible attack preparations. The rules of engagement were clear about our right to defend ourselves, but the political implications of any military action required extremely careful judgment about when and how to respond. I had seconds to decide whether the Iranian boats represented a genuine threat that justified defensive action, or a probe designed to test our reactions and create an incident that could be used for propaganda purposes. The decision required balancing the safety of my crew and ship against broader strategic considerations that extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. My choice to maintain defensive readiness while attempting to communicate our peaceful intentions through position and speed changes rather than weapons deployment proved to be correct when the Iranian boats eventually withdrew without making any overtly hostile moves. But the incident demonstrated the kind of split-second decision-making that commanding officers face in contested waters, where military and diplomatic considerations intersect. The successful completion of that deployment, and particularly my handling of several similar incidents, led to my selection for promotion to Rear Admiral and assignment as commander of Destroyer Squadron 7 based in Japan. The assignment represented my entry into flag officer ranks and responsibility for the operations of multiple ships across a wide area of the Western Pacific. Flag officer assignments involved a fundamental shift from commanding individual ships to overseeing the operations of entire task forces whose missions could span multiple countries and extend over periods of months. The scale of responsibility was proportionally larger, but so was the potential impact of decisions on American interests and international stability. My assignment in Japan coincided with a period of increased tension on the Korean Peninsula, which required maintaining constant readiness for possible conflict while supporting diplomatic efforts to reduce tensions through military restraint and careful signaling. The work was challenging in ways that drew on every aspect of my professional development since leaving the Naval Academy. Technical competence remained important, but strategic thinking and diplomatic sensitivity were equally crucial for success in an environment where military actions had immediate political consequences. During the Korea crisis, my squadron was responsible for maintaining freedom of navigation operations in the Sea of Japan, while avoiding any actions that could be interpreted as preparation for offensive operations against North Korea. The balance required constant coordination with diplomatic officials and careful attention to how our operations might be perceived by multiple audiences. The successful management of those operations, particularly during several weeks when conflict seemed imminent, contributed to my selection for promotion to Vice Admiral and assignment as Commander of 3rd Fleet, based in San Diego. The position placed me in charge of all naval operations on the West Coast and in the Eastern Pacific, representing the culmination of a career progression that had begun with doubts about whether I could handle military discipline. 3rd Fleet Command involved responsibility for operations that extended from the West Coast to the international dateline, encompassing training, readiness, and operational missions that affected American interests throughout the Pacific region. The scope of the assignment required strategic thinking on a scale I'd never before experienced, with decisions affecting thousands of personnel and resources worth billions of dollars. My performance in that assignment led to my final promotion to Admiral and selection as Commander of Pacific Fleet, the position I held when I returned home for Emma's wedding. It was a role that placed me among the senior leadership of the United States Navy, responsible for operations across the largest ocean on Earth and the most strategically important region for American interests. The journey from uncertain midshipman to fleet commander had taken 13 years and required personal growth that extended far beyond military training. I had learned to lead by serving, to command by understanding, and to influence by earning respect rather than demanding it. Standing in that reception hall, listening to Dad describe me as someone who couldn't figure out what she wanted to do with her life, I thought about the hundreds of decisions I'd made that affected thousands of lives, the strategic plans I'd developed that influenced national policy, the complex operations I'd commanded that protected American interests around the world. The contrast between his perception and reality was so complete that it might have been funny if it weren't so painful. But the pain came not from his inability to see who I'd become, but from the recognition that he'd never really tried to see who I was. The revelation of my rank at Emma's wedding wasn't just about correcting a misconception. It was about finally claiming space for my own story after years of letting others define me. It was about standing up not just for myself, but for everyone who had ever been dismissed, underestimated, or reduced to someone else's limited understanding of their potential. As I watched Dad struggle to process the information that his disappointing youngest daughter was actually a fleet commander, I realized that the moment represented more than personal vindication. It was a recognition that some stories can only be told by the people who live them, and that sometimes the most important victories are the ones that happen when people finally see you for who you really are. The journey from that small town in Oregon to flag officer rank had required leaving behind not just a place but a version of myself that other people found comfortable and unthreatening. It had meant choosing difficult challenges over easy acceptance, growth over comfort, reality over the stories that other people preferred to tell about me. But standing there in my Navy dress with the weight of command experience behind every word I spoke I finally understood that the choice had been worth making. Not because it proved Dad wrong about my capabilities, but because it proved me right about my own potential. The applause that followed Lieutenant Commander Peterson's recognition of my service was gratifying, but what mattered more was the moment when Dad finally saw me clearly for the first time in 32 years. It had taken becoming an admiral for him to understand that his youngest daughter might have something valuable to contribute to the world. That recognition, delayed as it was, represented the beginning of a conversation that we should have started years earlier. Whether we could build a relationship based on mutual respect rather than disappointed expectations remained to be seen, but at least now we both knew who we were talking to. The evening air outside the reception hall carried the scent of summer flowers and the distant sound of ships, horns from the naval base where my career had begun so many years before. As I stood on those steps receiving salutes from officers who understood what my rank represented, I felt the satisfaction of a story finally told completely and truthfully. It had taken 13 years and thousands of miles to get from that uncertain girl boarding a plane in Portland to the Admiral standing confidently in her hometown. But every challenge and every achievement had been worth it, to arrive at this moment of clear recognition and honest respect. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.